My name is Daniel Avery, and I am 43 years old, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a dramatic person. I am a structural engineer. I have spent the better part of 2 decades calculating the precise load tolerances of bridges, dams, hospital ceilings, and skyscraper foundations. My entire professional life is built on the rejection of drama in favor of data. I deal in numbers, in certainties, in things that either hold or they don't, things that either fail or they don't, things that can be measured and predicted and controlled with the right level of knowledge and the right level of care. I say this because what I am about to tell you is dramatic. It is deeply, almost unbearably dramatic. And I need you to understand that I am not the kind of person who exaggerates. I am not the kind of person who reaches for the extraordinary interpretation when the ordinary one is available. When I tell you that what happened on the morning of March the 9th changed my understanding of what human beings are capable of, I am not reaching for poetry. I am telling you the precise, structural, load-bearing truth. My name is Daniel Avery. I am 43 years old. I am a structural engineer from Connecticut. I have a wife named Claire. I have a 9-year-old daughter named Rosie, who wanted to build a bridge out of spaghetti. And on March the 9th, I boarded British Airways Flight 2276 from Heathrow to JFK as a completely unremarkable 43-year-old man returning home from a professional conference. And 31,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, both engines on that aircraft stopped. Not one engine, both of them, simultaneously. 212 people, a full aircraft, 31,000 feet up, 400 miles from the nearest land in any direction, and the engines, both of them, simply stopped. And in the cabin, while people screamed, while oxygen masks fell from compartments, while a retired British Army officer behind me pressed 2 fingers to my shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, while the flight attendant at the back of the plane stood in the aisle of a gliding aircraft and used her voice like a weapon against panic. In the cabin, in seat 13C, 1 row ahead of me, a small girl closed her book. She closed it carefully. She placed it on the seat beside her with the spine up and the page marked. She sat up straight. She put both feet flat on the floor. And she began to think. Her name was Mia Solano. She was 11 years old. And she is the reason I am sitting here, talking to you right now. I want you to stay with me for the next 200 minutes, because this story does not go where you think it goes. You think you know the shape of it: plane emergency, brave child, happy landing, inspirational lesson. You are wrong. What you do not know yet, what I did not know for months after the landing, months after the incident reports and the airline statements and the newspaper articles, is the truth at the center of this story. The truth that broke me open when I finally learned it. The truth that I have been carrying around ever since, like a structural engineer carries a calculation that changes every assumption he ever made. Stay with me. I'm going to tell you everything. It starts 11 days before the flight. It starts in London, at a conference about bridges, with a phone call from my wife that I almost missed because I was being exactly who I always am, buried in data, certain of my numbers, completely in control of the small, predictable, thoroughly engineered world I had built around myself. It starts with me being wrong about what I knew, and it ends with a girl at an airport window, watching planes, knowing exactly what she was going to become. Stay with me. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because I release stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. And I want to know, right here in the comments before you go any further, have you ever been in a situation where someone completely unexpected turned out to be the person who knew exactly what to do? Drop it below. I read every single one. The conference was called the International Symposium on Bridge Infrastructure and Load Analysis. I know what that sounds like. I know that to 99% of the people listening to me right now, that title sounds like the most boring sequence of words in the English language. But I want to tell you something about boring things. The boring things are the ones that keep the world standing up. Every bridge you've ever driven across, every building you've ever been inside, every overpass that has held the weight of thousands of cars without a single creak of alarm. That's what we do in rooms like that. We argue about numbers so that the numbers hold. I had been in London for 11 days. The conference was held at a hotel near Canary Wharf. That part of London where the glass towers catch the Thames light and throw it back in long, silver strips. I love London. I love its particular kind of gray stubbornness, the way it keeps building on top of itself, the way you can be standing in a street that has been a street since the Romans and also be looking at a building that was finished last Tuesday. There's something deeply structural about London. Layers on layers, each one load-bearing, each one held up by what came before it. But after 11 days, I was ready to go home. Claire called the night before my flight. It was about 8 in the evening, London time, which meant it was 3 in the afternoon in Connecticut, and I could hear from the background noise, the low television hum, the particular kind of distant child clatter that means someone is being 9 years old in another room, that she was in the living room with Rosie, managing the end-of-school day while also calling me, because that is the kind of person Claire is. She manages multiple things simultaneously and makes it look like she is managing one thing, very calmly. "You're getting on that flight tomorrow," she said. And the thing about Claire is that she does not say things like that out of suspicion or nagging or the particular relationship anxiety that makes people ask questions they already know the answer to. She says it the way a structural engineer states a load specification. Here is the fact. Here is the requirement. Let us proceed on that basis. "Of course I am," I said. "Because last time you missed a flight," she said. "That was... You told me you had an emergency consultation with the transport authority. It was a legitimate consultation. You came home with a signed copy of a book about suspension bridges. It was a very interesting consultation. Daniel." "Claire." She laughed. That particular laugh she has, low, genuine, slightly exasperated, deeply warm. I have been listening to that laugh for 15 years, and it still does something to my chest every single time. It's the laugh of someone who has decided, long ago and without reservation, that the person they are married to is worth laughing at rather than with sometimes, and that this is fine, and that she wouldn't have it differently. "Rosie wants to talk to you," she said. Rosie came on. 9 years old. My daughter. If I am the load-bearing structure of our family, steady, calculated, occasionally stubborn, Rosie is the thing the structure exists to protect. She has her mother's directness and her father's tendency to disappear into research. She had apparently been researching bridge construction since October of the previous year, when her class had been assigned a science project and Rosie had, without consulting anyone, decided that spaghetti bridges were the frontier she intended to conquer. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the pasta situation." "Hello to you, too. Mrs. Harrison says the project is due Friday." "I'm aware. You said you'd help me calculate the load tolerances." "I said I'd help you build a bridge. The load tolerances are the interesting part." She was not wrong. My daughter, 9 years old, sitting in a Connecticut living room with spaghetti bridge load tolerances on her mind, and I felt a wave of something so large and warm and specific that I had to sit down on the edge of my hotel bed. That specific feeling of loving your child so much it becomes almost structural, like it's holding you up. "I'll be home for dinner tomorrow," I told her. "You said that last time." "This time I mean it." "You always mean it," she said, and it was not an accusation. It was just a fact. It was just Rosie being precise, the way she always is, the way I hope she always will be. "You always mean it. You just sometimes don't manage it." Both things true. Both things held. We said good night. I went to sleep. I woke up at 6:15, ate a hotel breakfast that was technically food, and took a taxi to Heathrow Terminal 5 through a gray London morning that felt, in retrospect, like the last ordinary morning of a particular version of my life. Terminal 5 at Heathrow is a cathedral of movement. It's one of those places that was designed by architects who understood that an airport is not just a functional space. It's a place where people are leaving, or arriving, or both, and where the air itself has a particular emotional weight. High ceilings, that particular quality of light that comes through glass at angles, the sound of dozens of languages happening simultaneously, all of them carrying the same handful of human things, goodbyes and arrivals, and the specific anxiety of people checking and rechecking whether their gate has changed. I found gate 32 and took a seat with my laptop. Around me, the gate filled in the way gates do, gradually, then all at once. Business travelers like me, heads down, radiating the particular energy of people for whom airports have become so familiar they have ceased to be interesting. Families redistributing their weight across plastic seats, children inserting themselves into the only comfortable position available, which is somehow always draped horizontally across the adults nearest them. I noticed the woman and the two children, because the woman had the specific stillness of someone who is very tired and has decided that stillness is the most efficient way to manage the next several hours. She was perhaps late 30s, dark hair pulled back, a large canvas bag organized with obvious care in her lap. Beside her, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, round-faced, dark-eyed, currently pressing his entire face against the floor-to-ceiling gate window with the laser focus of a child for whom a baggage cart is genuinely the most interesting thing happening in the world. And the girl, she was sitting on the other side of the woman, feet tucked under her in the plastic chair, back straight, reading, not on a device, an actual book, physical, with a cracked spine that suggested it had been read many times or read very hard, and a cover I could just barely make out from my seat. The History of Flight, from Kitty Hawk to the Jet Age. An unusual choice for an airport, I thought. Most people, in the hours before a flight, choose not to think about the mechanics of what they're about to do. Most people occupy themselves with the human-scale certainties. A magazine, a phone, a podcast, the negotiation of a gateside coffee shop. This girl was sitting in an airport, about to board an aircraft, reading about the long and frequently catastrophic history of humans attempting to stay aloft in machines heavier than air. She didn't look nervous. She looked absorbed, completely, specifically absorbed, the way that very few adults and a surprising number of children manage to be absorbed in something, as if the rest of the gate, the noise, the movement, the several hundred strangers rearranging themselves around her, simply did not exist. I am an engineer. I notice things that are slightly out of specification, not in a judgmental way, in a data-gathering way, the way your brain flags a detail as interesting without you consciously deciding to flag it. This girl was slightly out of specification. Not wrong, not alarming, just notable. A small deviation from the expected that the pattern-recognizing part of my brain filed away, without telling me why. I would understand why, eventually. We boarded at 8:50. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, a workhorse of commercial aviation, 232-seating configuration, the kind of aircraft so common and reliable that it has become effectively invisible, the way the most load-bearing things often do. I've since learned everything there is to know about the 737-800. I've since read the manufacturer specifications and the safety records and the maintenance logs and the specific performance parameters of its engines at altitude. At the time, I knew almost nothing about it. I got on. I found 14C. I stowed my carry-on. I opened my laptop. In front of me, in 13C, the girl opened her book. Her name was Mia Solano. I did not know her name. I did not know anything about her. I knew that she was small, perhaps 10 or 11, with a dark braid and a serious face, and a book she was clearly intending to finish before we landed. I knew her mother, whose name I would learn was Elena, had the organized exhaustion of someone managing a long trip with 2 children on limited sleep. I knew the boy Tomas, I'd later learn, 7 years old, was already showing signs of falling asleep, his round head listing toward his mother's arm with the slow inevitability of a child's gravity. What I did not know, what none of us on that aircraft knew, was that Mia Solano had been taking flying lessons for 3 months, that she had begun with a retired RAF wing commander named James Okafor at a small airfield outside of Bristol, driving there every Saturday morning with her mother, who had not entirely understood why her daughter had become so fixated on aviation at age 10, but had decided that the fixation deserved to be taken seriously, because everything about Mia deserved to be taken seriously. I did not know that Mia had, in addition to the History of Aviation book, a second book in the seat pocket in front of her, a technical manual she had checked out from her school library titled Flight Operations, Emergency Procedures, and Aircraft Systems. I did not know she had been reading it for 3 weeks, in the evenings, after dinner, while Tomas played and her mother watched television, reading it with the focused attention of someone who is not studying for an exam but simply needs to know. I did not know that her instructor, James Okafor, had a particular philosophy about learning to fly. He believed, and told his students, often, that memorization comes first and understanding fills in behind it. He believed that in an emergency, you do not have time to think. You have time only to remember. And so he made his students, all of them, from teenagers to retired professionals, memorize the emergency checklists. Not read them, not be familiar with them. Memorize them. Recite them from memory at the start of every sun, the way a musician plays scales, the way an athlete runs the same drill, until the knowledge stopped being something you reached for and became something you simply had. Mia had been doing this for 3 months. For 3 months, every Saturday morning, she had stood in front of a small whiteboard in a hangar at a Bristol airfield and recited emergency procedures from memory, while a 61-year-old former RAF pilot checked her against a reference card and said nothing when she was right, which she almost always was. I did not know any of this. I sat in 14C with my laptop and my low data and my spaghetti bridge guilt, and I thought about home. We climbed through the gray London cloud. We leveled off at 31,000 feet. The engines settled into their deep, reassuring note. The service trolley came and went. I ordered coffee. I ate something. I opened a spreadsheet. Beside me, in 14B, a woman named Priya, who worked in pharmaceutical research and had taken a sleeping pill before boarding, was already deeply asleep, her head tipped against the seat with the particular bonelessness of ambient rest. Across the aisle, in 14D, a teenager named Cal, traveling alone to visit his father in New York for the first time, without his mother, had been texting said mother at intervals of approximately 90 seconds with updates on his location, his altitude, his current emotional state, and the quality of the pretzels. Behind me, in 15C, a man named Graham, retired British Army officer, currently living in Connecticut to be near his grandchildren, a man of perhaps 65 with the particular physical stillness of someone who has spent significant time in conditions where unnecessary movement is a liability, was reading a paperback thriller with methodical patience. We were 2 hours and 42 minutes out of Heathrow. We were, by every available measure, perfectly safe. And then I heard the sound. Not the sound that comes later. Not the alarms. Not the screaming. Not the horrible absence of the engine note that you don't know you've been listening to until it stops. A smaller sound first. A preliminary sound. A low, rhythmic fluctuation in the background hum, like a washing machine that's slightly unbalanced. A vibration that travels up through the seat cushion and into your lower back before it reaches your ears. The kind of thing that, in any other context, you might dismiss as turbulence. The kind of thing that, in this context, sat up in the primitive part of my brain and paid attention in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I looked up from my laptop. I looked at the ceiling of the aircraft, and I thought, something is different. I had no idea how right I was. Before I go any further, if you can feel the tension already building, subscribe right now and hit the bell. This story has 6 acts, and every single one of them will change the way you think about what human beings are capable of under pressure. And tell me, in your own life, have you ever had a moment where you sensed something was wrong before you could explain why? Before any evidence appeared, just a feeling. Tell me in the comments. I want to know. The aircraft banked. That is the only word for it. Not turned. Not adjusted course. Banked, sharp, sudden. A roll to the left that had no business existing in the smooth, controlled flight path of a cruising commercial aircraft. Every loose object in the cabin moved at once. My coffee tipped, and I caught it by instinct. Bags fell from overhead compartments. Not all of them. Just the ones that were slightly unlatched, that had been riding the small vibrations of normal flight in a precarious state that the sudden bank now resolved into gravity. Someone behind me made a sound that was not quite a word. The service cart, which had been stowed at the back of the plane, hit the galley wall with a sound like a small car accident. A hard, metallic, wrong sound. And then the engines changed. I need to explain this to you as precisely as I can, because I don't think the description does justice to the experience unless you understand what you're listening for. At cruising altitude, a Boeing 737-800's engines produce a sound that sits at roughly 83 decibels inside the cabin, not because the engines are quiet, but because the aircraft's insulation absorbs and distributes the sound until it becomes a kind of steady, structured pressure that you stop consciously registering about 40 minutes after takeoff. It becomes the baseline, It becomes the silence inside the noise, if that makes any sense. It becomes the thing against which you measure everything else. When that baseline shifts, every human being within range feels it in their chest before they understand it in their mind. The note dropped. Not by much. A few hertz. Barely measurable. But the effect in the cabin was immediate and total. Heads came up. Eyes opened. People who had been asleep, reading, watching films, locked in their private bubbles of flight. All of them registered the change the way animals register a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Something atavistic, something underneath language, something installed in the human nervous system by 10,000 years of needing to notice when the environment changes in ways that matter. Priya, beside me, jolted awake from her ambient sleep with the disoriented blink of someone who cannot immediately account for where they are or why they feel afraid. Cal, at the window, pressed his face to the glass, and then pulled back from it as if whatever he'd seen outside had confirmed something he'd hoped wasn't true. Graham, behind me, went quiet. Not the quiet of sleep. Not the quiet of distraction. The specific quiet of a man who has been in dangerous situations before and has learned, at a cellular level, that the first response to danger is not movement or sound but assessment. I could feel it through the seat back. A stillness that was actively still, that had decision in it. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a chime. That polite, functional little chime. Ding. As if what was happening was a minor inconvenience. As if the appropriate response to what was happening was a gentle audio notification. And then the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We are working on the situation and will update you shortly. Cabin crew, please be seated. Captain Marcus Webb, 51 years old, 23 years with British Airways, a man who had spent more than 20,000 hours in commercial flight, who had landed in thunderstorms and crosswinds and the particular white-knuckle conditions that aviation professionals train for and most passengers never experience. A man who, by every account and every metric, was exactly the kind of person you want in a cockpit when something goes wrong. His voice was calm. I want to be specific about that. Not calm in the way of someone concealing panic. Not the brittle, forced calm of someone performing steadiness they don't feel. Calm in the way of someone who is genuinely managing a situation. The calm of competence. The calm of a person who knows what the problem is and knows what the procedure is and is currently executing the procedure. I heard it, and I felt the cabin respond to it. The small collective exhale. The visible settling of shoulders. The universally human tendency to take our emotional calibration from whoever appears to be in charge. An instinct so deep it bypasses conscious thought. The way a school of fish turn simultaneously, without any individual fish deciding to turn. Technical difficulties, said Priya beside me, still half asleep. Her voice the texture of someone reading words she doesn't fully understand yet. It's okay, I said, and I believed it. I believed it because I had nothing, at that specific moment, to make me not believe it, because the captain had said technical difficulties, and the captain's voice had said managed, and I am the kind of person who trusts expertise, who has built his entire life on the idea that the people who know things can be relied upon to tell you what you need to know. And then the second engine stopped. Not changed. Stopped. There's no subtlety in this. There's no musical description that does justice to what it sounds like when the second engine of a Boeing 737-800, at cruise altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, ceases to function. It stops the way a light stops when you flip the switch. One moment it is there, that deep, omnipresent, load-bearing hum that has been holding the world in order for 2 hours and 42 minutes, and the next moment it is simply not there. And in its place, the wind, just the wind, 210 miles per hour of Atlantic air moving over the fuselage, a sound like the inside of the world's largest seashell, a sound that is not quiet and is not loud but is absolutely, completely, catastrophically wrong in a way that every single one of the 212 people on that aircraft understood simultaneously, without being told. The cabin erupted. I do not use that word lightly, and I do not use it for effect. It erupted. 212 people's fight-or-flight systems firing at once, 212 sets of vocal cords and hands and bodies responding to the same signal in the same millisecond, screaming, crying, the sudden crash of standing up, the reflexive grabbing of the nearest solid thing, which was usually the arm of the person next to you, whether you knew them or not. The oxygen masks fell from their compartments, not deployed, not the full emergency deployment, loosened, swaying on their yellow tubes above every seat in the cabin, moving with the slight roll of the aircraft. Each one a question that nobody in the cabin wanted to answer. Priya grabbed my arm. She had been awake for perhaps 30 seconds from an ambient sleep, her pupils still adjusting, her mind still trying to establish the basic parameters of where and when she was. And now she was in a gliding aircraft over the Atlantic and holding my arm with both hands at a grip strength that told me she had processed the situation faster than her conscious mind had caught up to it. "What is happening?" she said. Not a question. The syntax of someone stating a fact they cannot accept. "I don't know," I said. That was true. I knew something was catastrophically wrong. I knew both engines were not running. I knew we were no longer under power in any conventional sense. But the specific facts, the ash cloud, the flameout, the glide ratio, the 19 minutes, the distance to Shannon, none of those facts were available to me. I was a structural engineer in 14C with a tipped coffee and a frightened pharmaceutical researcher holding my arm and the sound of the wind where the engine should be. And then Rosa appeared. I want to take a moment for Rosa, because I don't think she gets enough of this story. Her full name was Rosa Maria Fernandez. She was 38 years old. She had been a British Airways cabin crew member for 14 years, and she was standing in the aisle of an aircraft that had just lost both engines over the Atlantic, and she was not screaming. She was upright. She was looking at the back of the plane where two men had stood up, had physically risen from their seats with the intention of doing something, though what exactly they intended to do about a dual-engine flameout at altitude was unclear. And she was looking at them with the focused, structured authority of someone who knows that the most dangerous thing in this cabin right now is not the engine failure. The most dangerous thing in this cabin right now is panic. And panic, unlike engine failure, is something she can do something about. "SIT down," she said. 2 words. She didn't shout them. She projected them. The specific trained projection of someone who has spent 14 years making themselves heard over engine noise and crying babies and the ambient roar of a full aircraft. 2 words that carried in them no fear and no negotiation and no possibility of being argued with. The men sat down. I watched this happen, and I felt something shift in me. Not relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that not everyone in this cabin was as lost as I was. That were people here who knew what to do, who were doing it, who were going to keep doing it regardless of what the engines were or weren't doing. And then, in the row in front of me, I heard a child's voice. Clear, calm, specific. "Mama, stay still. We need to stay calm." I looked up. Mia Solano had closed her book. She had placed it on the seat beside her with the spine up and the page marked, and she was sitting straight, and she was looking at the back of the seat in front of her, and her expression, God, her expression. I have spent months trying to find the right description for it. It was not the blankness of shock. It was not the forced stillness of someone suppressing terror. It was the expression of someone looking at a problem. Just looking at a problem. Calmly and directly and with complete attention. The way you look at something you have the tools to address. Her mother, Elena, had one arm locked around Tomas, who was crying in the particular sustained way of a 7-year-old who understands something is very wrong without understanding what. Elena's other hand was pressed over her own mouth. Her eyes were wide and dark and bright with fear. "Mia," she whispered. "Mia, what is happening?" And Mia turned to her mother. Were people here who knew what to do, who were doing it, who were going to keep doing it regardless of what the engines were or weren't doing? And then, in the row in front of me, I heard a child's voice. Clear, calm, specific. "Mama, stay still. We need to stay calm." I looked up. Mia Solano had closed her book. She had placed it on the seat beside her with the spine up and the page marked, and she was sitting straight, and she was looking at the back of the seat in front of her, and her expression, God, her expression. I have spent months trying to find the right description for it. It was not the blankness of shock. It was not the forced stillness of someone suppressing terror. It was the expression of someone looking at a problem. Just looking at a problem. Calmly and directly and with complete attention. The way you look at something you have the tools to address. Her mother, Elena, had one arm locked around Tomas, who was crying in the particular sustained way of a 7-year-old who understands something is very wrong without understanding what. Elena's other hand was pressed over her own mouth. Her eyes were wide and dark and bright with fear. "Mia," she whispered. "Mia, what is happening?" And Mia turned to her mother and she said, 11 years old, in a gliding aircraft, over the Atlantic Ocean, she said, "One engine is out, maybe both. The plane is in a controlled descent. The pilots are trained for this. We need to stay calm, so they can work." The row in front of me went quiet. The row behind me went quiet. The people immediately around us, the 6 or 8 people within earshot, went quiet, not silent. The cabin was not silent. The crying continued. The prayers continued. The sound of the wind was inescapable. But the people near us went quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when someone has said something so precisely and calmly accurate that it cuts through the noise and lands. I stared at her. She wasn't looking at me. She was still looking at the seat in front of her. Then she reached down, without looking, and took her mother's hand. And the intercom came back on. And it was not Captain Webb. It was First Officer Amanda Thorne, 34 years old, 2 years on this route. A woman who, by every account, was excellent, precise, and unflappable. And her voice was still professional, still controlled. But there was something underneath it. A compression, a thinness, the sound of someone holding something very large behind a very small and very carefully maintained door. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have declared an emergency. We are currently executing emergency procedures. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and follow all instructions from cabin crew." She did not say, "Everything is fine." She did not say, "This is routine." And the absence of those reassurances was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The masks deployed fully. The yellow cups swung down on their tubes, and the cabin went from frightening to something else entirely. Something that I don't have a name for in ordinary language. Something that exists only in the specific register of knowing, with certainty, that the situation is real. And Mia Solano reached into the seat pocket in front of her and took out her second book. "If your heart is already hammering good, that means you're here with me. And this is exactly where I need you to stay. Subscribe right now so you never miss a story like this. I post every week, and I promise you nothing I release will waste your time. And I need to ask you something important. When the oxygen masks drop and the announcements stop being reassuring, what do you think goes through a person's mind in those first 30 seconds? What do you think you would do? Tell me in the comments. Be honest, I need you to understand something about what it feels like to be inside a gliding aircraft. Not from a distance. Not from an incident report. Not from a news article. Not from a second-hand account of someone who heard it from someone else. From the inside. From seat 14C. From the seat of a structural engineer who spends his professional life calculating the conditions under which things hold together. Sitting in a thing that was no longer holding together in the way it was designed to. The sound is the first thing. The engines are gone. You know this. But knowing it and experiencing the absence are two entirely different things. And I have to be honest with you about what it is like to experience that absence. It is like being in a room where the lights have gone out. Except the room is 200 feet of pressurized aluminum, and you are 31,000 feet above water. That is 3 miles deep, and the lights are not coming back on, and no one is going to tell you where the switch is. The wind is constant. That sound, that inside seashell sound, that sound of enormous velocity applied to an object not designed to be silently aerodynamic, that sound does not stop. It is, in some ways, the worst sound, because it is not the sound of anything breaking. It is the sound of the aircraft doing exactly what it is designed to do in the absence of thrust, which is glide. Controlled descent. The pilots will later tell me, in various interviews and reports, that the aircraft performed exactly as it should have in those conditions. The aircraft did its job. The aircraft, stripped of its engines, fell at the precise mathematically predictable rate that the laws of aerodynamics prescribed. A Boeing 737-800, at cruise altitude, with no engine thrust, has a glide ratio of approximately 17:1. For every foot the aircraft descends, it travels 17 feet forward. Glide ratio is not the same as safety. What glide ratio means is that you have some control, not full control. Some. You have the shape of the wings and the management of pitch and the careful, exhausting work of two pilots who are doing, right now, in a cockpit you cannot see, everything that 23 and 12 years of training respectively have prepared them to do. I did not know the glide ratio. I did not know, in real time, any of the specific numbers. What I knew was the wind sound and the angle of the floor, slightly, almost imperceptibly wrong, the slant of a gliding aircraft being just enough to feel like the world is tilting, like gravity has been subtly renegotiated. And I knew what Mia was doing, because Mia was reading. I know how that sounds. I know what image it creates, a child, apparently unconcerned, reading a book while an aircraft falls toward the ocean. But it was not that. It was nothing like that. I have thought about this moment more than any other moment in this story, because I think it is the most important moment, the moment that tells you everything you need to know about who Mia Solano is. She was not reading because she was unaware. She was reading because she was aware. She had taken the technical manual, the one she'd had in the seat pocket, the one she'd been carrying since before we boarded, and she was reading it with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and is moving through the pages methodically until they find it. Her finger traced the lines. Her lips moved silently. Her braid had come slightly loose, and she was not fixing it. There was no bandwidth available for hair. Her mother had both arms around Tomas now. Elena was not praying out loud. She was praying in the particular internal way that people pray when they are too frightened for words, when prayer becomes less language and more signal, the simple urgent broadcast of need into whatever might be listening. She was looking at the back of the seat in front of her. Then she would look at Mia. Then back at the seat. The rhythm of a person trying to find something to anchor to the man behind me. Graham said nothing. He had put his thriller away. He was sitting with both hands on his knees, and his breathing was measured in the specific way that trained breathing is measured. The diaphragmatic rhythm of someone who has been taught to manage their own physiology in high-stress conditions. Cal, the teenager at the window, had stopped texting his mother, not because he had run out of things to say, but because he was looking out the window at the ocean below, and the reality of the ocean below had stopped his fingers mid-sentence. He told me this later, at Shannon Airport, in the matter-of-fact tone that teenagers sometimes use when they have processed something that would break an adult. He said, "I could see the water and I thought, that's really far down and also really close, and I didn't know how both those things could be true at the same time." Both things can be true at the same time. That's 31,000 feet for you. And then Mia found what she was looking for. She ran her finger along a line. Read it. Read the next line. Looked up. Looked at the seat back display in front of her. The moving map display. That little icon of the aircraft, the altitude readout, in the corner of the screen. Looked at it for perhaps 15 seconds with an expression of intense, specific calculation. Then she turned around. She turned around in her seat, and she looked at me. Direct, brown eyes, completely clear, completely present, completely undramatic. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you an engineer?" And I want to pause here and tell you what it felt like to be asked that question, in that moment, by that child. The first feeling was confusion, not deep confusion. I'd heard the question, I understood the question, but the kind of confusion that comes from unexpectedness, from the mismatch between the category of question and the category of moment. We were in a gliding aircraft. The appropriate categories of question in a gliding aircraft are we going to be okay? What is happening? Where's God? How long do we have? Not, are you an engineer? The second feeling was something I can only describe as a recalibration. The question had an assumption in it. The question had a because in it, even if the because hadn't been stated yet. She wasn't asking me what I did for casual conversation. She was asking me because she needed something from the answer, and something in the way she was asking, the directness, the calmness, the absence of any panic in her eyes, made me sit up straighter. "A structural engineer, yes," I said. "Do you know aircraft systems at all?" "No. I'm not, no." She nodded. "Processed this. Filed it." "Okay," she said. "The engines can be restarted. The pilots are probably attempting it right now. But there's a problem with our approach angle. She pointed at the seatback display, at the tiny airplane icon on the moving map, and the altitude readout in the corner. I can see our rate of descent on that display, she said, and our position relative to the coastline. Based on what I've read about glide ratios at this aircraft weight and altitude, I think we're descending at a slightly steeper angle than we need to. I stared at her. Slightly steeper, I said. 2 degrees, she said. Maybe 2.5. At our current descent rate, we'll fall short of Shannon if that's where they're heading, which it probably is because it's the nearest option with a runway long enough. But if the pitch is adjusted, if the nose comes up 2 degrees, we extend the glide range enough to possibly make a difference. I looked at her. I looked at the display. I looked at her again. How do you know this? I said, I've been taking flying lessons for 3 months. My instructor makes me memorize the emergency checklists. I've also been reading. She held up the book. This, for 3 weeks. I looked at the book. Flight operations, emergency procedures, and aircraft systems. I looked at the altitude display. The number was decreasing. Not rapidly, controlled, managed, but decreasing. Steadily decreasing. The way a savings account decreases when you are spending more than you earn and you know, eventually, it will reach 0. Mia, I said, and I used her name before I knew it. The way you sometimes use a name you've absorbed by proximity without registering that you've absorbed it. The pilots are trained for this. They know. I know they know, she said, but I can see something from out here that they can't see because they're in the cockpit. They have their instruments, and their instruments will tell them the same thing I'm telling you. But if there's any margin of uncertainty in their readings, if there's any calculation they're not 100% sure of, then having someone from outside the cockpit confirm it might matter. I absorbed this, she said, and I think it should be communicated by someone who won't increase the panic in the cabin. An adult walking fast toward the front of the plane looks like a threat. A child walking quietly looks like she's going to the bathroom. There was a long moment. Outside the window, the ocean was visible between breaks in the cloud. Cold, gray, enormous. The kind of water that does not want you in it. What exactly do I need to tell the flight attendant? I said, and she told me. She talked for perhaps 4 minutes, which is not a long time in most contexts, and is an extremely long time in a gliding aircraft. She talked about pitch and glide ratio and the specific calculation she'd made based on the altitude display and the moving map. She talked about the engine restart sequence and the window of altitude within which restart was most feasible. She talked with the focused efficiency of someone who has one chance to transfer critical information and knows it. She referenced specific pages of the manual as she talked. She did not rush. She did not over-explain. She gave me exactly as much as I needed to communicate the essential point to someone who could act on it. I understood perhaps half of it in real time, but I understood enough, and I understood something else, which was not in the technical manual and which nobody had taught her. I understood that she was right about the optics. I understood that the panic in this cabin, which was real, which was present, which was one wrong move from becoming the secondary disaster inside the primary disaster, was a variable she had accounted for as carefully as she'd accounted for the pitch angle. She wasn't just thinking about the physics of the aircraft. She was thinking about the physics of the cabin, the social physics, the way that people in crisis take their cues from everything around them, and that everything around them needed to stay as calm as possible for as long as possible. An 11-year-old girl had independently run the human factors calculation and arrived at a conclusion that most adults in that cabin would not have been capable of arriving at while not in a crisis, let alone in the middle of one. I unbuckled my seatbelt. Graham's hand found my shoulder. 2 fingers, firm. A whole paragraph in 2 fingers, from a man who had been in places where paragraphs were too slow. It said, I see what you're doing. I'm here. Go. I went. I walked up the aisle. Slowly. I know it sounds impossible to walk slowly in those conditions, but I walked slowly because Mia had told me to, and because the part of my brain that was still capable of processing information had accepted what she said about optics and was acting on it. I nodded to 2 people who met my eyes as I passed them. The small, universal nod that says, okay. Human. Not in free fall. moving with purpose. Rosa was in the forward galley. She saw me coming, and her eyes sharpened. I leaned close. I kept my voice low and my body language deliberately, carefully unremarkable. I said, "There's a passenger in 13C who has information about the glide angle that might be useful to the flight deck. She's 11 years old. She's been taking flying lessons, and she's calculated that a 2-degree pitch correction might extend the glide range enough to reach Shannon." Rosa looked at me. Then she looked past me, down the aisle, at seat 13C. I watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. I watched her assess the information, the source, the risk of passing it on versus the risk of not, the weight of 19 minutes and an unknown quantity of remaining altitude, and a small girl who had said something that was either useful or wasn't. She said, "Wait here." She went to the cockpit door, knocked. One long, two short. The crew code. The door opened. She went in, and I stood in the forward galley of a gliding aircraft and counted. I counted to 45. If you are still here with me right now, you need to be subscribed. Seriously, this story only gets more extraordinary from here, and the next act contains the thing that I did not know for 7 months, the thing that shattered my understanding of what had actually happened. Don't miss it. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now. And here's my question for you. In that forward galley, counting to 45, what would you have been thinking about? Not in theory. Really. What would your mind have gone to? Tell me in the comments. I want to know who you thought Rosa was in the cockpit for 45 seconds. I know this because I counted every one of them. I counted because counting was the only form of control available to me in that moment. I am an engineer. I reach for measurement when I am afraid, the way other people reach for prayer or for the hand of the person nearest them. Measurement says, the world has a shape. Even right now, even in this, the world has a shape and I am measuring it, and as long as I am measuring it there is a thread between me and the world that I can hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The wind sound continued. From behind me in the cabin, I could hear Rosa's colleague managing the cabin. The voice, the words, the structured calm of professional people doing the thing they are trained to do in conditions they have trained for but never, in most cases, experienced for real. I could hear crying, not screaming. The screaming had subsided into something more sustained, and in some ways more heartbreaking. The low continuous grief of people who have accepted that the situation is real and are not yet sure how it ends. 19, 20, 21. I thought about Rosie. Not in a narrative way, not in the organized, sequential way that I think about most things. I thought about her the way you think about someone when the world has been stripped of everything else, and only the essential things remain. I thought about her voice on the phone, saying, "I'm glad you're okay." Dad in the voice she uses when she's being serious rather than 9. I thought about the spaghetti bridge, which existed somewhere in our house in a state of preparation that I had promised to assist with, and now might not get to. I thought about Claire, about the laugh, about the particular way she says my name when she is amused rather than frustrated, a half-beat longer, the second syllable carrying more weight, the whole word a kind of affectionate exasperation that means, you are impossible and I am keeping you anyway. 37, 38, 39. I thought about Mia. I thought about her sitting in 13C with the book in her lap, and her feet on the floor, and that expression, that specific expression of someone looking at a problem. And I thought about what it meant that an 11-year-old girl had been calmer than me, had been more functionally calm than almost anyone on this aircraft, in the worst situation most of us would ever be in. Not because she wasn't afraid. That came later. That was the thing that came later that I want to get to. The thing that broke me when I finally understood it. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. She was 11 years old, and both engines were out, and the ocean was below, and her mother was frightened, and her brother was crying. She was afraid, and she was doing it anyway. 44. 45. The cockpit door opened. Rosa came out. She did not come to me. This is the thing I noticed immediately. She looked at me. A quick, specific look that I interpreted as, "You did the right thing." And then she walked past me, down the aisle, and she crouched in the aisle beside seat 13C. She crouched beside Mia, and she said something quietly, and Mia listened, and then Mia said something back. I could not hear the exchange from where I stood. The wind sound and the cabin noise made it impossible. But I watched it happen. This small girl, sitting straight in her seat, speaking to an adult flight attendant who was crouched to her level. And the quality of the exchange was not child and adult. It was something more equal than that. It was information being exchanged between two people. And the information was flowing in both directions, and both parties were treating it with the respect that important information deserves. Then Rosa stood up and went back to the cockpit. I made my way back to 14C. Graham's hand on my shoulder again, brief, firm. A period at the end of a sentence. I sat down. Priya was holding the armrests with both hands and staring at the seat in front of her. Cal had his forehead against the window glass. "What did you do?" Graham said, very quietly. "I don't know yet," I said. And it was true. I genuinely didn't know. I had passed information. I did not know if the information was accurate. I did not know if it was useful. I did not know if the cockpit door had opened in time, or if the calculation had been right, or if any of what the girl in front of me had told me bore any relationship to what the pilots were actually seeing on their instruments. I did not know anything except that 45 seconds had passed, and the wind was still the only sound, and the ocean was still below us, and we were still falling. And then, 7 months later, I found out what had actually happened. I have to stop here and tell you about the moment I found out, because I've been building to this for the entire story, and I need you to understand how it landed for me when I finally read it. 7 months after the landing at Shannon, British Airways and the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch published their full incident report on Flight BA 2276. It is a long document, dense, technical, formatted with the particular dispassion of official investigation language, the language of facts arranged in chronological order, with all the emotion stripped out, so that only the structure remains. I read it in my office, on a Thursday afternoon, with a cup of coffee that went cold. I read it 3 times, and then I sat in my office for a long time, not reading anything. Because here's what the report contains, and here's what nobody in the news coverage, nobody in the initial airline statements, nobody in the first wave of second-hand accounts, had told me. The pilots already knew about the glide angle problem. Captain Webb and First Officer Thorne had identified the pitch correction requirement at the 11-minute mark. They had run the numbers. They had the calculations. They had independently determined that a 2-degree pitch adjustment would extend their glide range into Shannon's reach. They were already planning to make the correction. They had not made it yet at the 16-minute mark when Rosa knocked on the cockpit door, but they were going to. They were going to do exactly what Mia had suggested before Mia's suggestion reached them. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The information was not new. Mia had not told the pilots something they didn't know. She had not saved the aircraft by introducing a solution they hadn't found. The solution existed. The pilots had found it. The solution was already in the cockpit. And when I read that, my first feeling, I'll be honest with you, was something close to deflation. Not disappointment in Mia. Never that. But the particular deflation that comes from realizing that the story you've been telling yourself, the story of the child who knew the thing the adults didn't know, the knowledge that saved the plane, was not quite the story. And then I kept reading, and I found this passage in First Officer Amanda Thorne's own written account, published in an aviation safety journal 6 months after the incident. She wrote, and I am going to paraphrase this carefully because these are her words and she owns them, but the substance of what she wrote was this. At the 12-minute mark, she and Captain Webb were discussing the pitch correction. They had the calculation. They were confident in the math. But they were also, and she is very honest about this, very precise about this, aware that they were operating under extreme stress, under conditions neither of them had experienced outside of simulator training, and that the cumulative cognitive load of managing a dual-engine emergency, while simultaneously calculating glide ratios, while simultaneously monitoring altitude, while simultaneously managing the radio emergency calls, while simultaneously trying to reach Shannon with a cabin full of frightened people behind them had introduced something into their decision-making that she describes as a margin of uncertainty. Not in the math, in the application of the math, in the gap between knowing the right answer and having the conviction to act on it. She says that when the cabin crew message arrived, relaying the information from the passenger in 13C, Something happened that she struggled to find the right language for. She describes it as confirmation, not of new data. Confirmation of existing data from an independent source. Someone outside the cockpit. Someone with no access to their instruments, no access to their calculations, no access to anything except a seatback display and a technical manual and 3 months of flight lessons, had independently reached the same conclusion they had reached, through different means, using different inputs. And then she writes something that I have read so many times that I know it by heart. She writes, "Captain Webb looked at me and said, 'She's right. Let's do it.' And we made the pitch adjustment that she's right. Not, 'This is new information.' Not, 'This changes our plan.' Not, 'This is something we hadn't thought of.' She's right. The child had confirmed something they already believed. And that confirmation, that independent verification from outside their sealed, pressurized, stress-saturated system, gave them the certainty to act with the conviction the moment required. I need to explain to you what this means, from an engineering standpoint, because I think this is the most important thing in this entire story, and I don't want you to miss it. In structural engineering, we have a principle called independent verification. When you are designing something critical, a hospital foundation, a dam wall, a bridge that will carry thousands of cars every day, you do not run your calculations once and proceed. You run your calculations, and then someone else runs the same calculations independently. And if they reach the same answer through different means, you proceed with a level of confidence you could not have had from one set of calculations alone. The independent verification does not add new information. It confirms existing information. And the confirmation, the fact that two independent systems, starting from different places, have arrived at the same place, is not redundancy. It is certainty. It is the difference between knowing and being certain enough to act. Mia Solano was the independent verification. She did not save the plane by telling the pilots something they didn't know. She saved the plane by confirming something they knew, confirming it from outside the cockpit, confirming it through different means, confirming it in a way that gave two excellent, exhausted, terrified but functional pilots the certainty they needed to act with full conviction in the narrowest of windows. In that gliding aircraft, falling at 17 feet forward for every foot down, with perhaps 6 or 7 minutes of glide range remaining when the confirmation arrived. In that aircraft, the difference between pretty sure and certain enough to act was the difference between the ocean and the runway. And that difference was an 11-year-old girl who had spent 3 months memorizing emergency checklists because her instructor told her that memorization comes first and the understanding fills in behind it. But here's the part that breaks me. Here's the part that I promised you was coming. The thing inside the twist, the center of the story, I end those 45 seconds when Rosa was in the cockpit. In those 45 seconds when I was standing in the forward galley counting, when the cabin was in its sustained frightened noise, when the wind was the only sound where the engines should have been, Mia turned to her mother. She took Elena's hand, and she said, "I'm scared, Mama." Just that. 3 words. Elena told me this weeks later, in a cafe in Bristol, her hands around a mug of tea, Tomas asleep in a pram beside the table, her voice very quiet and very level in the way of someone who has practiced telling a story until they can tell it without breaking. She said that Mia had turned to her in those 45 seconds, and she had said, "I'm scared, Mama." And then she had held her mother's hand, not for comfort, not as a child reaching up. She had reached sideways, the way you reach for someone who is equally frightened, the way equals hold each other. She had been the one, the calm one, the knowing one, the one who had held the cabin together through the force of her stillness. And then for 45 seconds she had put that down. She had allowed herself to be 11 years old. She had allowed herself to be afraid. And then Rosa had come out of the cockpit, and Mia had let go of her mother's hand, and she had turned back to face front, and she had picked up her book. I think about those 45 seconds more than I think about any other moment in this story. I think about the deliberateness of them, the way she created a window for her own fear, a contained, bounded, 50-second window, and then closed it. Not because she wasn't afraid anymore. She was still afraid. She would be afraid until the engine restarted, until the wheels touched the runway at Shannon, until her mother's arms were around her and the aircraft was on the ground. But she had put the fear somewhere it couldn't interfere with what needed to be done. At 11 years old, there is nothing else I can tell you about Mia Solano that is more important than that 45 seconds. Not the glide ratio calculation, not the technical manual, not the emergency checklists memorized or the lessons she'd taken or the sheer, staggering scope of what she knew. All of that matters. All of that was necessary. But the thing that made it possible, the thing without which the knowledge is just knowledge and does not become action, is the 45 seconds, the contained, deliberate, chosen window for fear, followed by the equally deliberate, equally chosen return to what needed to be done. I have told this story many times, since March the 9th, to Claire, to Rosie, to colleagues at work, to the airline's counselor I saw 4 times in the months after the flight. And every time I tell it, the part that stops people, the part that makes the room go quiet in a different way, is not the dual-engine flameout. It is not the glide ratio. It is not even the independent verification. It is those 45 seconds. It is the 3 words she said to her mother. "I'm scared, Mama." And then the fact that she kept going anyway. I know this story is changing something in you right now. It changed something in me too. And it still does, every time I think about it. If you want more stories that do that get into the bone of what it means to be human under pressure, subscribe right now. I release one every week. And I need you to tell me something. Is there a moment in your life when you were terrified and you kept going anyway? Not because you weren't afraid, but because something outside of yourself needed you to? Tell me in the comments. This one I really want to read. Act 6, The Resolution. Engine 2 restarted at the 16-minute mark. I will never, not for the rest of my life, no matter how long that life is, hear a sound the way I heard that sound. It started below, behind, a low, building vibration that you feel in your feet before it reaches your ears. And then the sound, that deep, structural, foundational roar, climbing back up through the registers like something coming home, like something returning from a very long absence, like the bass note of a symphony you thought was over suddenly picking back up. The cabin lights surged. One of those micro-events, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but in a cabin that has been running on emergency systems, that had been lit with the flat, insufficient light of emergency power for 16 minutes. The surge of full cabin lighting was visible, was physical, was felt. The displays reset. Every seat back screen flickered and reloaded. The altitude display, the moving map, the small icon of the aircraft, which had been steadily, inexorably moving downward on the display, and which now, oh God, now leveled slightly. And then the cabin. I've tried many times to find the right word for what happened in that cabin when Engine 2 restarted. Eruption is what I keep coming back to, because it is the only word that captures the sense of something that has been under enormous pressure for a very long time releasing all at once. Not an explosion, not violent, not destructive, but a release, an outward expansion of sound and movement and breath, and the particular human expression of relief that goes beyond ordinary happiness, the relief that sits right next to grief because it has been that close to the thing you are relieved about. People screamed, and this time the screaming was not fear. It was the other thing, the thing screaming does when the body doesn't know what else to do with joy and terror and relief all at once. People cried. People laughed. People who had spent 16 minutes holding themselves in the particular rigid stillness of suppressed panic now let go of that stillness all at once, and the movement went through the cabin like a wave. The man 2 rows behind me said something in a language I didn't recognize, and it didn't matter, because the tone is universal. Someone near the back started applauding, and within 5 seconds the entire cabin was doing it. That ragged, uneven, genuine applause that has nothing to do with performance, that is not for anyone in particular except the moment, except the sound of the engine, except the fact of being still in the air. Priya beside me was crying. I realized after a moment that I was also crying, not in the way that feels chosen, in the way that the body decides to cry before the mind is caught up to the reason for it, the way that relief, in its fullest form, requires some kind of physical release, or it has nowhere to go. Engine 1 restarted 90 seconds later, and then it was both of them, both engines, the full, complete, foundational roar of a 737 to 800 under full power, and the note, That note I had not consciously registered on the way out from Heathrow. That note I had been hearing for 2 hours and 42 minutes before it stopped and did not fully appreciate until it came back. That note was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It still might be. I think it might still be the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. Captain Webb's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Both engines are running. A pause. Long enough for the cabin to exhale. Long enough for people to put their hands on the faces of the people next to them, on the arms, on the shoulders. Long enough for Graham, behind me, to breathe out a single long breath that sounded like he had been holding it for much longer than 16 minutes. We are declaring a diversion to Shannon Airport in Ireland. We will be landing in approximately 35 minutes. I want to assure you that the aircraft is safe, and you are in good hands. I am deeply proud of the behavior of everyone on this flight." He paused again. "All of you," he said. "All of you." 2 words that were not in the standard post-emergency announcement. 2 words that stepped outside the format. I have thought about those 2 words more times than I can count, because I think Captain Webb, who I have never met, who I communicated with only through the medium of his voice over an intercom, said them knowing that someone in the cabin had earned them in a specific way. I don't know that, but I believe it, and I believe it because of what Rosa told me later, that when she relayed Mia's information in the cockpit, Captain Webb had listened without comment, and then he had said, "Tell her thank you." Rosa had gone back to Mia. She had crouched in the aisle, and she had said, "The captain says thank you." And Mia had looked at her and said, "Tell him he was already doing it right." I was watching from my seat when Rosa walked back to the galley. I couldn't hear what Mia had said, but I watched Rosa's face as she walked, and there was something in it, not amusement, exactly, something more layered than amusement. The look of someone who has just encountered something they did not fully expect and are filing it in a new category they've just had to create. Tell him he was all ready. I stood beside her. We didn't say anything for a while. Outside, a small turboprop was taxiing toward the runway, its engines at a high, clean note, its propellers turning fast enough to blur. She watched it with the total absorption. She gave everything that moved through air. "Do you actually understand all of it?" I asked eventually. The glide calculations, the engine restart windows, the pitch angles. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it. Not the automatic yes of a child who has been asked if they understand and says yes, because yes is the expected answer. She actually considered the question. "Most of it," she said. "Some of it I've memorized, but don't fully understand yet. My instructor says that's okay. He says the memorization comes first, and then the understanding fills in behind it. He sounds like a good teacher." "He's very strict," she said. And then, almost immediately, "I think that's the same thing." I looked at her. "Mia," I said, "when you're a pilot." She turned and looked at me. Direct, brown eyes, completely clear. "When you're a pilot," I said, "you're going to be extraordinary." And something happened in her expression that I have tried to describe accurately every time I've told this story. Not pride. Pride is something you feel when you've done something beyond expectation. What she felt, what showed on her face for just a moment, was something quieter, something that did not have surprise in it, something more like, yes, like the settling of a thing that has been true for a long time and has now been confirmed by one more piece of evidence, one more data point in the accumulating case for something she has always known about herself. She turned back to the window. "I know," she said. 2 words. Not arrogance. Not the performance of confidence. The simple, structural truth of a person who knows what they're made of, who has tested it and found it sound, who is not boasting but simply, accurately, reporting what the data shows. I know. We stood at that window for another 10 minutes. Neither of us said much. The turboprop reached the runway and turned and held for a moment, that held breath before takeoff that I have watched from aircraft windows and airport windows 100 times and never noticed before. And then it went, the engines at full power, the acceleration, the lift, the moment of leaving the ground. Mia watched it go with her whole self. I watched her watch it, and I thought, the world is going to be very lucky. I went home that evening on a charter flight arranged by British Airways. I landed at Heathrow at 9 o'clock in the evening. Claire was in the arrivals hall with Rosie. who was in a school uniform that had clearly been worn since morning and gave no evidence of any intention to be replaced, and who came at me across the arrivals hall with a full body, all in, completely dignity-free abandon of a child who has decided that this particular reunion justifies the full available speed. I caught her. I held her for a long time. I thought about a girl at an airport window, watching planes on the tarmac, knowing, with the clear, unflinching, load-tested certainty of someone who has checked their own structure and found it sound, exactly what she was going to become. And I thought, the memorization comes first, and the understanding fills in behind it. And you don't stop when you don't understand yet. You keep going, and you hold someone's hand for 45 seconds when you need to, and then you pick up your book, and you watch the planes go 7 months after Flight BA 2276. The full incident report was published. It detailed the dual-engine flameout caused by volcanic ash ingestion, the glide to Shannon, and the successful emergency landing. It commended Captain Marcus Webb and First Officer Amanda Thorne for exceptional airmanship. It described the cabin crew's management of 212 frightened passengers as outstanding. It did not mention Mia Solano by name. At Elena's request, Rosa received the British Airways Chairman's Award. In her acceptance speech, she said she had not acted alone. She said she had been helped by the passengers, by all of them, but especially by one. She did not say who. Everyone who was on that flight knew. Captain Webb, asked by a journalist whether there was anything unusual about the emergency, said, and I read this in the online article with something happening in my chest, he said, I received confirmation at a critical moment that we were right. That confirmation mattered. It matters more than I can explain in a short interview. It was the kind of thing that you don't expect from the direction it came from, and that is exactly why it worked. That is exactly why it worked, from the direction it came from. In February of the following year, Mia Solano was awarded the Royal Aero Club Certificate of Merit for her actions during the BA 2276 emergency. She was, and remains, the youngest recipient in the award's 123-year history. At the ceremony, which I attended, standing at the back with Elena and a quietly stunned Tomas, who had by then been told enough of the story to understand that his sister had done something significant, though the full technical picture was still largely opaque to him at age 7. At the ceremony, a senior official from the Royal Aero Club said that Mia represented the finest qualities of aviation, not just the technical knowledge, but the judgment to use it and the courage to act. Mia received the certificate. She shook hands. She said thank you. And then, on the way out of the ceremony hall, she stopped at a display case that held a photograph of the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk. That famous photograph, the one where the aircraft is just barely off the ground and Orville is at the controls and Wilbur is running alongside, and she looked at it for a long time. I was beside her. Do you know, she said, that the first flight lasted 12 seconds? I didn't know that, I said, and the fourth flight, the same day, lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. She was looking at the photograph with that particular absorption. They kept going. Every flight that day was longer than the one before. They kept going, I said. Yes, she said. That's the whole thing, isn't it? Not a question. That's the whole thing. She is currently enrolled in the Junior Aviation Academy at Bristol Flying Center. Her instructor still says she is the most gifted student he has ever taught. She is 12 years old. She is not even close to finished. And neither, I think, are any of us. Not really. Not when we understand what she understood at 31,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, in a gliding aircraft, with the wind where the engines should have been, that the memorization comes first, that the understanding fills in behind, that you don't stop when you don't understand something yet, that you are allowed 45 seconds to be afraid, and then you pick up your book, and you watch the planes, and you keep going. If this story stayed with you, if there's something in it that you're still thinking about right now, then you are exactly the person I make these videos for. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join the community of people who believe that the most extraordinary stories are the true ones. And here is my final question for you, the one I want you to think about longest before you answer. What is the thing you have memorized, not fully understood yet, but memorized, that you are trusting the understanding will eventually fill in behind? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.